The autumn of 1887 brought more than just falling leaves to the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, Montana Territory. It brought a scandal so shocking that people would whisper about it for generations. 4 young sisters, sold like livestock by their own blood, disappeared into the night under circumstances that would have broken weaker souls. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most desperate situations, and that a single act of defiance can change the course of history itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The trouble began on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning when Ezekiel Morrison received the telegram that would seal the fate of his 4 nieces. Standing on the porch of his ramshackle house on the outskirts of Copper Ridge, the 43-year-old man read the words that confirmed his brother's death in a mining accident 3 states away. Most uncles would have felt grief, responsibility, perhaps even love for the orphaned children about to enter their care. Ezekiel Morrison felt only opportunity. Inside the house, 16-year-old Charlotte Brennan was teaching her younger sisters their letters using a worn primer their mother had treasured. At 14, Emily showed remarkable skill with numbers, helping to manage the household accounts their father had taught her to keep. 12-year-old Grace possessed an artistic talent that manifested in delicate sketches she drew on scraps of paper, while 8-year-old Rose had inherited their mother's beautiful singing voice and could recite entire poems from memory. The Brennan sisters had been living with their uncle for only 3 months since their parents' tragic deaths, but already they understood that their presence was unwelcome. Ezekiel made no secret of his resentment, constantly complaining about the burden of feeding and housing 4 growing girls. He worked sporadically as a blacksmith's assistant, spending most of his earnings on whiskey and gambling, leaving the sisters to fend for themselves with whatever scraps they could manage. "Girls!" Ezekiel's voice boomed through the thin walls of the house as he burst through the front door, rainwater dripping from his threadbare coat. The sisters immediately stopped their lessons, recognizing the dangerous edge in their uncle's tone. Charlotte instinctively moved closer to Rose, positioning herself between the youngest and whatever storm was about to break. "Your father's gone and gotten himself killed," Ezekiel announced with callous bluntness, waving the telegram in his grimy fist. "Crushed in a cave-in, along with any hope of him sending money to support you burdens." The words hit the girls like physical blows. Emily gasped and clutched Grace's hand, while Rose began to cry silent tears. Charlotte, as the eldest, tried to maintain composure even as her world crumbled around her. Their father had been working in the Colorado silver mines, sending what little he could spare to help with their care. Now that Lifeline was severed permanently, what does this mean for us? Charlotte asked quietly, though she feared she already knew the answer. Ezekiel's smile was cold and calculating. "It means, my dear nieces, that I need to find a more profitable arrangement for your continued existence." Over the following days, Ezekiel's true nature revealed itself with horrifying clarity. He began entertaining visitors at odd hours. Rough men who looked at the sisters with appraising eyes that made Charlotte's skin crawl. She caught fragments of conversations about high demand and good prices and shipping arrangements. When she tried to question her uncle about these meetings, he backhanded her so hard she tasted blood for hours. The sisters huddled together in their shared room each night, whispering fears they barely dared voice. Charlotte had heard stories about men who bought young women for purposes she refused to contemplate. Emily, despite her youth, understood enough about their uncle's gambling debts to realize they had become commodities in his desperate schemes. Grace drew pictures of birds flying away, while Rose sang lullabies to comfort her older sisters as much as herself. The breaking point came exactly 1 week after the telegram arrived. Charlotte was hanging laundry behind the house when she overheard Ezekiel negotiating with a man whose voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. 4 healthy girls, you said, the stranger was asking. The eldest is 16? Just turned 16 last month, Ezekiel confirmed eagerly. Prime age, if you take my meaning. The others are 14, 12, and 8. All well-behaved, all trained in household duties. And you're certain there are no other relatives who might come looking for them? Dead certain. Their parents are gone. Grandparents died years ago, and I'm their only living relation. Once they're gone from here, there's nobody to ask questions. Charlotte's blood turned to ice as she realized what was happening. Her uncle wasn't just planning to abandon them. He was actively selling them to men whose intentions could only be imagined. The stranger mentioned something about establishments in San Francisco and lucrative arrangements that made Charlotte's stomach churn with terror. That night, she gathered her sisters in their room and shared what she had overheard, Emily's. Face went white with understanding while Grace began sketching, frantically, dark images of cages and chains that revealed her innocent mind's attempt to process unthinkable realities. Rose simply clung to Charlotte's skirt, too young to fully comprehend, but old enough to sense the mortal danger surrounding them. We have to run away, Emily whispered, her voice shaking but determined. Tonight, before he can carry out whatever deal he's making. Where would we go? Grace asked practically. We have no money, no relatives, nowhere to hide. Anywhere is better than staying here, Charlotte replied with fierce conviction. We'll figure out survival once we're away from him. But their plans for escape were discovered before they could act. Ezekiel, suspicious of their hushed conversations, searched their room while they were doing chores and found the small bundle of possessions Emily had hidden under her mattress. His rage was swift and brutal. He locked them in the root cellar behind the house, a dank, windowless space that reeked of rotting vegetables and despair. You'll stay down there until your new owners come to collect you, he snarled through the heavy wooden door. Maybe a few days in the dark will teach you the value of cooperation. The cellar was a nightmare of cold, dampness, and scurrying creatures that the sisters couldn't identify in the absolute darkness. They had no food, only a bucket of stale water, and no way to know how much time was passing. Rose developed a fever on the second day, her small body unable to cope with the harsh conditions. Grace held her close, trying to share what little warmth she could, while Emily calculated how long they might survive without proper food or medical attention. Charlotte spent those hellish hours planning. If they somehow escaped this immediate crisis, they would need more than just a plan to run away. They would need allies, resources, and above all, they would need to ensure that Ezekiel could never again wield such power over vulnerable people. Her parents had raised her to believe in justice, and even in their darkest moment, she refused to accept that evil could triumph simply because it was backed by adult authority and legal guardianship. On the third day in the cellar, they heard voices above, Ezekiel arguing with someone whose tone suggested disagreement rather than negotiation. The sisters pressed their ears to the wooden planks overhead, straining to understand what was happening. The deal's off, an unfamiliar voice was saying. My associates have decided the risk is too high. Too many questions being asked around town about those girls. But we had an agreement. Ezekiel protested, his voice high with desperation. I've got debts that need paying, and those girls are my property to dispose of as I see fit. Find another way to pay your debts, the stranger replied coldly. We don't deal with situations that might bring unwanted attention. The sound of departing horses filled the sisters with conflicting emotions, relief that this particular threat had passed, but terror about what desperate measure Ezekiel might attempt next. A man with gambling debts and a taste for violence would not simply accept defeat. He would find other buyers, other arrangements, other ways to profit from their vulnerability. As night fell and they remained trapped in the cellar, Charlotte made a decision that would prove more prophetic than she could have imagined. Whatever happened next, She would not allow her sisters to become victims of circumstances beyond their control. Somehow, some way, she would find the strength and resources to fight back against the corruption that treated human beings as merchandise. She had no way of knowing that 50 miles away, a rancher named Jacob Sullivan was learning about 4 missing girls and feeling a familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had once driven him to stand up against injustice, regardless of personal cost. The paths that would bring them together were already being set in motion by forces neither could yet comprehend. But in that dark cellar, surrounded by her frightened sisters and facing an uncertain future, Charlotte Brennan began the transformation from helpless victim to determined fighter. The girl who emerged from that ordeal would be forever changed, carrying within her the seeds of a revolution that would indeed change history, though in ways no one could have predicted. The rescue was coming, though it would arrive in a form none of them expected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jacob Sullivan had built his reputation on 2 things: his ability to read the land and his unwillingness to ignore injustice when it crossed his path. At 34, he owned one of the most successful cattle operations in Montana Territory. But wealth had never dulled his memory of what it felt like to be powerless. As he rode into Copper Ridge that crisp October morning, he carried with him a letter that would change everything. The letter had come from Dr. Margaret Whitfield, the territory's only female physician and one of the few people Jacob trusted completely. Margaret had delivered his sister's children, saved his foreman's life after a rattlesnake bite, and proven herself a woman of uncompromising integrity in a world that often rewarded compromise. When she wrote requesting an urgent meeting about a matter of conscience that requires immediate attention, Jacob had saddled his best horse and ridden through the night. He found Dr. Whitfield at her small clinic on the edge of town, tending to a miner with a broken arm. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her intelligent blue eyes held the same steely determination that had helped her become the first woman licensed to practice medicine in the territory. She finished setting the man's bone before turning her attention to Jacob, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, washing her hands with the methodical precision that marked all her actions. "What I'm about to tell you will test your faith in human decency, but I know you're one of the few men with both the resources and the character to act on it." Margaret led him to her private office, where she poured 2 cups of strong coffee and settled into the worn leather chair behind her desk. 3 days ago, I was called to examine a young woman who had collapsed in the general store. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and signs of physical abuse. She was terrified, kept saying she had to get back before he noticed she was gone. Jacob leaned forward, already sensing where this story was heading. "Go on." Her name was Charlotte Brennan. 16 years old, acting as primary caretaker for 3 younger sisters. Their parents died recently, and they've been living with their uncle, Ezekiel Morrison. Margaret's voice hardened. "Jacob, that man is selling those girls. I've seen the evidence with my own eyes." The coffee cup in Jacob's hand stilled halfway to his lips. "Selling them? To brothel operators, most likely." Charlotte overheard negotiations, saw money change hands. "The younger girls are being held in some kind of cellar or basement, while buyers are arranged." She escaped briefly to try finding help. "But no one in town will act against Morrison because he's convinced them the girls are his legal property." Jacob's jaw tightened as familiar rage began building in his chest. 20 years earlier, he had watched his own sister suffer under the control of a man who believed ownership gave him unlimited rights. That time, he had been too young and powerless to intervene effectively. This time would be different. "Where are they now?" he asked quietly, but Margaret could hear the steel beneath his calm tone. "That's the problem. Charlotte collapsed before. She could tell me exactly where Morrison is keeping them. She managed to say something about a cellar and 3 days without food, but then she fainted. I've had her under medical care since then, but she's been delirious with fever. Margaret stood and moved to the window overlooking the town's main street. I've tried approaching the sheriff, the mayor, even the territorial judge. They all say the same thing. Morrison is the girl's legal guardian, and family discipline is not a matter for outside interference. One of them actually suggested that maybe some firm guidance would benefit the girls in the long run. And Morrison himself? Disappeared. His house has been empty for 2 days. I suspect he's moved the girls somewhere more secure while he finalizes whatever arrangement he's making. Margaret turned back to Jacob, her expression grim. Charlotte keeps saying, before it's too late, but I'm afraid it may already be too late. Jacob drained his coffee cup and stood, his decision already made. Take me to her. Charlotte Brennan lay in a narrow bed in Margaret's clinic, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. Even unconscious, she clutched a small scrap of paper in her fist, a child's drawing that Jacob recognized as the work of someone trying to process trauma through art. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and occasionally she would mutter words like Grace and Rose and hide them better. She's been asking for someone named Emily, Margaret said softly. I assume that's one of the sisters. The fever broke this morning, so she should regain consciousness soon. As if summoned by their conversation, Charlotte's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she stared at the ceiling in confusion, then panic flooded her features as memory returned. She tried to sit up, but Margaret gently pressed her back down. Easy, child. You're safe here. This is Jacob Sullivan. He's here to help. Charlotte's gaze fixed on Jacob with desperate intensity. My sisters. I have to get back to them. It's been 3 days, he said 3 days. And then her voice broke, unable to finish the sentence. Jacob pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, his manner calm but urgent. Charlotte, I need you to tell me everything you can remember about where your uncle took your sisters. Every detail might be important. The story that poured out of Charlotte over the next hour painted a picture of systematic abuse and calculated cruelty that made Jacob's hands clench into fists. She described the buyers who had visited their house, the negotiations she had overheard, and most crucially, her uncle's mention of an old mining claim where he could store merchandise safely until transport arrangements were finalized. He has a claim about 10 miles north of town, Charlotte said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Abandoned silver mine that played out 5 years ago. Pa used to say Morrison bought it cheap, thinking he could make it profitable again, but he was too lazy to work it properly. Jacob exchanged glances with Margaret. An abandoned mine would provide perfect isolation for Morrison's purposes, far from curious neighbors, with natural hiding places underground and easily defensible against unwanted visitors. It was also the kind of place where terrible things could happen without anyone ever knowing. How long since you escaped? Jacob asked. 4 days, maybe 5. I lost track of time in the cellar. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. Rose was getting sick when I left. She's only 8, and the cold down there. What if they're already gone? What if I'm too late? You're not too late, Jacob said with quiet conviction. But we need to move quickly. Can you describe the layout of the mine, the buildings, anything that might help? Charlotte closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember details through her exhaustion and fear. There's a main shack where the miners used to stay, but it's mostly collapsed. The mine entrance is about 50 yards behind it, going straight into the hillside. Morrison mentioned something about storage rooms that the original miners carved out for equipment. How many men does he have with him? I saw at least 3, maybe 4. Rough types who looked like they'd done this kind of work before. Charlotte struggled to sit up again, this time managing to stay upright despite Margaret's protests. Mr. Sullivan, I know you don't know us, and I know this isn't your responsibility, but those are my sisters. They're good girls who never hurt anyone, and they're probably terrified and hungry and thinking I abandoned them." Jacob stood, his mind already working through the tactical challenges of what he was contemplating. A direct assault against 4 armed men in a defensible position would be dangerous enough with a full posse. Attempting it alone would be suicidal. But every hour of delay increased the chances that the girls would be moved again, possibly beyond recovery. "I'll need help," he said, thinking aloud. "Men I can trust absolutely, who won't be intimidated by Morrison's connections in town. My foreman, Tom Bradley, served with distinction in the Civil War," Jacob continued. "And there's Samuel Red Hawk, a tracker who knows every inch of these mountains. Between the 3 of us, we might be able to approach the mine without being detected." Margaret moved to her medicine cabinet and began gathering supplies. "You'll need medical provisions. If those girls have been imprisoned for days without proper food or shelter, they'll require immediate care. And Charlotte, despite her condition, knows the layout better than anyone." "Absolutely not," Jacob said firmly. "Charlotte needs rest and recovery, not exposure to more danger." "With respect, Mr. Sullivan," Charlotte interrupted, her voice carrying a strength that belied her physical weakness, "those are my sisters, and I'm the only one who knows exactly where Morrison would hide them. You'll waste precious time searching rooms I could identify immediately." The debate that followed revealed the depth of Charlotte's determination and the complexity of their situation. Every moment spent in discussion was time stolen from the rescue, but rushing in blindly could result in the girls being moved or harmed before they could be reached. Finally, Jacob agreed to a compromise. Charlotte would guide them to the mine and point out the most likely hiding places, but she would remain safely outside while he and his men conducted the actual rescue. As they prepared to leave, Margaret pulled Jacob aside for a private word. "Be careful, Jacob. Morrison may be desperate enough to do something drastic if he feels cornered. And remember, even if you succeed in rescuing these girls, they'll still need a place to go. Their uncle was their legal guardian, and the law doesn't automatically transfer custody to well-meaning rescuers. One crisis at a time," Jacob replied grimly. "First we get them away from Morrison. Then we figure out how to keep them safe permanently." The ride to gather his men took 2 hours, time that felt like an eternity to Jacob as he imagined what the sisters might be enduring. But he forced himself to plan methodically, knowing that successful rescue required more than just righteous anger. It required strategy, coordination, and the kind of cold calculation that could overcome superior numbers and defensive positioning. By sunset, Jacob Sullivan was riding toward the abandoned mine with 2 trusted allies and a 16-year-old girl whose courage had already impressed him more than that of most grown men he knew. Behind them, Dr. Whitfield waited with medical supplies and a determination to provide whatever care the rescued sisters might need. What they would find at the mine would test all of them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, but Jacob had made a promise to himself during that conversation with Charlotte. No child would suffer abandonment while he had the power to prevent it. The fury that had been building in his chest since hearing Margaret's story was now focused into purposeful action. The rescue of the Brennan sisters was about to begin. The abandoned Morrison silver mine sat like a scar against the mountainside, its broken timber supports and scattered debris telling the story of dreams that had died hard. Jacob Sullivan crouched behind a stand of pine trees, studying the layout through his field glasses as the moon cast eerie shadows across the desolate landscape. Beside him, Charlotte Brennan pointed out details with the precision of someone whose sisters' lives depended on accuracy. "The main shaft entrance is there," she whispered, indicating a black opening carved into the rock face. But Uncle Ezekiel mentioned storage rooms that were dug off to the side for equipment. If he's keeping them underground, that's where they'd be. Tom Bradley, Jacob's foreman, shifted his weight carefully to avoid rustling the dry pine needles. Beneath them, a veteran of battles far more organized than this rescue mission. He had seen enough desperate situations to recognize both the dangers and opportunities their position offered. "I count 3 guards," he murmured, "but they're sloppy. Drinking around that fire like they're at a church social instead of guarding prisoners." Samuel Red Hawk had been silent for the past hour, using skills learned from his Lakota grandmother to scout the perimeter without detection. Now he returned with information that changed everything. 4 men total, he reported in his quiet, precise way. Morrison and 3 others. But there's something else, wagon tracks leading away. From here, maybe 6 hours old. Heavy loaded, heading southeast toward the railroad junction. Jacob felt his blood turn cold. "You think some of the girls are already gone?" "No," Charlotte said quickly, studying the tracks Samuel had pointed out. "I know my uncle. He wouldn't split up a valuable shipment unless he had to. Those tracks are probably from hauling supplies or equipment. He's too greedy to sell the girls separately when he can get a better price for a complete set." The clinical way she had to discuss her sister's situation as merchandise made Jacob's jaw clench with renewed fury, but he forced himself to focus on the tactical situation. 3 guards outside meant at least one person was probably below ground with the prisoners. The storage rooms Charlotte had mentioned would be isolated, defensible, and perfect for containing children who might try to escape. "We go in quiet," Jacob decided. "Tom, you circle around to the far side and create a distraction at exactly midnight. Nothing dramatic, just enough noise to draw attention away from the mine entrance. Samuel, you take position to cut off any escape routes toward town. I'll go down into the mine with Charlotte to locate the girls." "Mr. Sullivan," Charlotte began, but Jacob cut her off with a gesture. "You know I can't find them without you, and we can't afford to waste time searching wrong tunnels. But you stay behind me at all times, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" The next 20 minutes passed with agonizing slowness as they moved into position. Jacob had conducted enough cattle raids against rustlers to know that successful operations depended on timing, coordination, and the ability to adapt when plans inevitably went wrong. But this felt different, more personal, more urgent, with consequences that extended far beyond recovering stolen property. At exactly midnight, Tom Bradley kicked over a stack of rotting timber near the collapsed mining shack. The crash echoed across the mountainside like thunder, immediately drawing shouts and movement from the guards around the fire. 2 of them grabbed weapons and moved toward the sound, while the third remained at his post but turned his attention away from the mine entrance. Jacob and Charlotte moved like shadows across the open ground, their soft-soled boots making no sound on the rocky terrain. The mine entrance yawned before them, a black mouth that seemed to swallow the moonlight. Charlotte had described the layout, but actually entering the abandoned shaft felt like descending into hell itself. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale water, rotting timber, and something else, human misery that had soaked into the very rocks. Jacob's lantern cast dancing shadows on the tunnel walls as they moved deeper underground, following a path that branched off from the main shaft toward the storage areas Charlotte remembered. "Here," she whispered, pointing to a heavy wooden door that looked far newer than the rest of the mine's equipment. A crude padlock secured it, but Jacob had come prepared. The bolt cutters he carried made quick work of the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a sight that would haunt his dreams for years to come. 3 girls huddled together in a space barely large enough for storage crates, their arms wrapped around each other for warmth and comfort. Emily looked up first, her 14-year-old face gaunt with hunger, but fierce with protective instinct as she positioned herself between the door and her younger sisters. Behind her, 12-year-old Grace clutched a tattered doll while 8-year-old Rose lay frighteningly still, her breathing shallow and labored. "Charlotte?" Emily's voice cracked with disbelief and desperate hope. "Is it really you?" The reunion that followed was simultaneously heartbreaking and inspiring. Charlotte dropped to her knees and gathered her sisters in her arms, tears streaming down her face as she felt their thin bodies and saw the evidence of days spent in cold, darkness, and hunger. But even in their joy, the girls maintained the quiet caution that had become their survival mechanism. "We have to be silent," Emily whispered urgently. "There's a guard who comes down every few hours. He has a gun, and he said if we make noise, he'll hurt Rose." Jacob knelt beside the huddled group, his voice gentle despite the urgency of their situation. "I'm Jacob Sullivan, and I'm here to take you somewhere safe. But we need to move quickly and quietly. Can Rose walk?" Grace shook her head, her young face etched with worry beyond her years. "She's been sick since yesterday, fever and coughing. We tried to keep her warm, but—" Without hesitation, Jacob scooped Rose into his arms, feeling how light she was, how her small body trembled with illness. "Charlotte, take Emily and Grace. We move fast but quiet until we're clear of the mine. Then we run for the horses." The journey back through the tunnels felt endless, with every sound magnified by their fear of discovery. Rose stirred in Jacob's arms, her fever-bright eyes focusing on his face with the trust that only children can show to adults who radiate safety. "Are you taking us home?" she whispered. "I'm taking you somewhere better than home," Jacob replied softly. "Somewhere no one will ever hurt you again." They had almost reached the mine entrance when footsteps echoed in the tunnel behind them. Heavy boots, moving fast, accompanied by a voice Jacob recognized as belonging to Ezekiel Morrison himself. "Check the storage room," Morrison was snarling to someone. "Those buyers are arriving at dawn, and if those girls have somehow gotten loose, we're all dead men." Jacob motioned for the girls to press against the tunnel wall while he extinguished his lantern. In the absolute darkness, they could hear Morrison and his companion getting closer, their voices carrying clearly in the confined space. "Boss, what if someone's found them? What if that Charlotte girl brought help like she threatened? Then we kill whoever's down here and move the others tonight," Morrison replied with casual brutality. "I've got too much invested in this arrangement to let some do-gooder ruin it." The conversation revealed something that made Jacob's blood boil. Morrison wasn't just selling his nieces out of desperation or greed. This was a calculated business operation, probably one of many similar transactions he had conducted. These girls weren't his first victims, and they wouldn't be his last unless someone stopped him permanently. When the men reached the storage room and discovered it empty, their shouts of rage echoed through the mine like the howls of demons. Jacob knew they had perhaps minutes before the entire area would be swarming with armed searchers. The time for stealth had passed. "Run," he whispered to the girls, and they burst from the mine entrance into the moonlit night like escaping spirits. The next few minutes were chaos. Tom Bradley's diversionary tactics had drawn off 2 of the guards, but the 3rd was still at his post and spotted them immediately. His rifle shot cracked across the mountainside, the bullet chipping rock inches from Jacob's head as he carried Rose toward the tree line. Samuel Red Hawk appeared like a ghost, his own rifle silencing the guard with efficiency born of years hunting in territories where mistakes meant death. But more men were pouring out of the mine now, and Morrison's voice could be heard screaming orders for pursuit. The horses were waiting where they had left them, but mounting up while carrying a sick child and protecting 3 exhausted girls required precious seconds they didn't have. More rifle shots echoed behind them as Morrison's men reached the surface and began firing wildly into the darkness. "Go!" Jacob shouted to Charlotte as he lifted her into the saddle behind Emily and Grace. "Straight to Dr. Whitfield's clinic. Don't stop for anything." Tom Bradley had secured Rose in front of him on his horse, wrapping his coat around her small form to protect her from the cold night air. Samuel Red Hawk provided rear guard, his knowledge of the mountain trails allowing him to choose a route that would make pursuit difficult in the darkness. The ride back to Copper Ridge, became a desperate race against time and weather. Rose's condition worsened as the night wore on, her fever spiking and her breathing becoming more labored. Emily held Grace protectively while Charlotte fought to stay conscious despite her own exhaustion. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit gradually faded as Morrison's men discovered the difficulty of tracking experienced horsemen through terrain they knew intimately. Dr. Margaret Whitfield was waiting at her clinic with hot water, clean bandages, and a determination to save 4 young lives that had already endured far too much trauma. As Jacob carried Rose inside, he could see that the youngest Brennan's sister was fighting a battle against more than just illness. She was struggling against the accumulated effects of prolonged stress, inadequate nutrition, and exposure that would have broken many adults. "Get them warm and fed," Margaret ordered, her medical training taking precedence over questions about how the rescue had unfolded. "Slowly with the food. Their stomachs won't handle much at first. And someone needs to keep watch. Morrison won't give up easily, especially now that you've made him look like a fool." As dawn broke over Copper Ridge, 4 sisters were finally safe, warm, and surrounded by people who cared about their welfare rather than their market value. But Jacob Sullivan knew this rescue was only the beginning of a much larger challenge. Morrison was still free, still dangerous, and still legally their guardian. The girls needed more than just physical safety. They needed a future that Morrison couldn't destroy with legal maneuvering or violent retaliation. Looking at Charlotte, as she tended to Rose with the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to seek help, Jacob made a decision that would change all their lives. These girls wouldn't just survive their ordeal, they would thrive in ways that would eventually transform an entire territory's understanding of what children could achieve when given genuine opportunity instead of mere charity. The rescue was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Dawn brought more than just sunlight to Copper Ridge. It brought Sheriff Wade Harrison and 2 territorial marshals to Dr. Whitfield's clinic, their badges gleaming and their expressions grim. Jacob Sullivan had expected this confrontation, but seeing armed lawmen approaching the building where 4 exhausted girls were finally beginning to heal still made his hand drift instinctively toward his sidearm. "Mr. Sullivan," Sheriff Harrison called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the weary authority of a man who had been roused from sleep to deal with someone else's crisis. "I need to speak with you about last night's incident at the Morrison mine." Jacob emerged from the clinic, positioning himself squarely in the doorway. Behind him, he could hear Dr. Whitfield speaking in soothing tones to the sisters, but Charlotte's voice cut through the morning air with surprising steel. "There was no incident, Sheriff," she said, appearing beside Jacob despite his gesture for her to stay inside. "There was a rescue. 4 children being held prisoner were freed by men with enough courage to act when the law wouldn't. The eldest, Marshall, a gray-haired veteran named Captain William Thornton, studied Charlotte with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating witnesses and suspects. Young lady, Ezekiel Morrison has filed formal charges against Mr. Sullivan and his associates for kidnapping, trespassing, and destruction of property. He claims you and your sisters were removed from his lawful custody without proper authority. He was selling us," Emily's voice carried from the clinic window, where she had positioned herself to watch the proceedings, "to men who run brothels. We heard the negotiations." "Children often misunderstand adult conversations," Captain Thornton replied, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own words. "The fact remains that Morrison is your legal guardian, appointed by territorial court after your parents' deaths. Personal feelings about his methods don't override legal authority." Dr. Whitfield emerged from the clinic carrying a leather medical bag and wearing an expression that could have melted steel. "Gentlemen, would you like to examine the evidence of Morrison's lawful custody? 3 malnourished children, 1 with pneumonia that nearly killed her, all showing signs of prolonged confinement in unsanitary conditions. If that's legal guardianship, then our laws are worse than useless. Ma'am, we understand your concerns, Sheriff Harrison began diplomatically. But no, you don't understand anything, Margaret interrupted, her voice rising with controlled fury. You understand politics and property rights and keeping important men happy. You don't understand justice, or you would have acted when I first brought evidence of abuse to your attention 3 days ago. The confrontation that followed revealed the complex web of interests surrounding the Brennan sisters' fate. Morrison had indeed filed legal complaints, backed by influential men who owed him money or favors. But he had also made a crucial mistake. His business partners had fled when the rescue became public knowledge, leaving behind evidence of a trafficking operation that extended far beyond 4 orphan girls. Captain Thornton produced a folder containing documents that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Morrison's associates were apprehended this morning while attempting to board an eastbound train. They were carrying detailed records of previous transactions, buyer lists, and correspondence about establishing regular supply routes through this territory. Jacob felt a grim satisfaction as he realized Morrison's greed had finally betrayed him. How many other children? At least a dozen over the past 2 years, possibly more. We're still investigating. Thornton's expression showed the disgust of a career lawman confronting systematic evil. The problem is that Morrison claims complete ignorance of his partner's activities. He maintains that he was simply arranging proper placements for his nieces with respectable families. Respectable families don't conduct business in abandoned mines with armed guards, Charlotte said quietly, but her words carried the weight of absolute certainty. And they don't keep children locked in storage rooms without food or water. The legal complexities that emerged over the following hours painted a disturbing picture of how easily children could disappear within the territory's loosely enforced custody laws. Morrison's guardianship was legally valid, appointed by a judge, who had since died, leaving no clear record of the decision's reasoning. Challenging his authority would require evidence of unfitness that met strict legal standards, not just moral outrage, but Jacob had not built a successful ranch operation by accepting defeat when bureaucracy stood between him and necessary action. While the marshals conducted their formal investigation, he was making inquiries of his own through channels that operated outside official oversight. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Reverend David Walsh, pastor of Copper Ridges Methodist Church, appeared at the clinic that afternoon carrying a worn leather Bible and wearing an expression of barely contained righteous anger. "Mr. Sullivan," he said without preamble, "I understand you've taken an interest in the welfare of the Brennan children. I believe I have information that might prove useful in securing their permanent protection." What Reverend Walsh revealed in the privacy of Dr. Whitfield's office was explosive enough to destroy Morrison's credibility permanently. For months, he had been documenting Morrison's activities at the request of concerned parishioners who suspected abuse but lacked the social standing to challenge a legal guardian directly. "Morrison approached me 6 weeks ago," Walsh explained, spreading handwritten notes across Margaret's desk. "He wanted me to vouch for his character in case questions arose about his guardianship. During our conversation, he admitted details about finding good homes for difficult children that made my blood run cold." The Reverend had maintained detailed records of their discussions, including Morrison's casual mentions of previous placements, payment arrangements, and his philosophy that orphan children should earn their keep through whatever means necessary. More importantly, Walsh had documented Morrison's drinking binges and violent threats against anyone who interfered with his business. This is witness testimony from a respected community leader, Jacob realized, studying the careful documentation. Combined with the physical evidence Dr. Whitfield has gathered, it should be enough to petition for emergency removal of guardianship. But even as their legal case strengthened, Morrison was working to undermine their efforts through channels they hadn't anticipated. Word came through Samuel Red Hawk's network of contacts that Morrison had hired a lawyer from the territorial capital. An expensive advocate known for defending clients whose guilt was obvious, but whose resources were substantial. Henderson Blackwood, Captain Thornton identified when shown the lawyer's name. He successfully defended 3 men charged with trafficking in the past 5 years. If Morrison can afford his services, someone with serious money is backing this fight. The implications were troubling. Morrison's operation hadn't been a desperate man's attempt to solve financial problems. It was part of a larger network with resources sufficient to challenge territorial law enforcement. The girls weren't just fighting for freedom from one abusive guardian. They were threatening a business model that generated significant profits for powerful interests. As evening approached, Jacob found himself in Dr. Whitfield's kitchen, helping Charlotte prepare a simple meal for her sisters while wrestling with decisions that could determine their futures. Rose's fever had broken, but she remained weak and frightened, clinging to whoever was nearest with the desperate need of a child who had learned not to trust safety. Emily and Grace were recovering physically, but their eyes held a wariness that no children should possess. "Mr. Sullivan," Charlotte said quietly as she stirred a pot of broth, "what happens if they make us go back to him? If all this legal fighting doesn't work?" It was the question Jacob had been dreading, the possibility that haunted every plan he made. Morrison's legal rights as guardian were clear, regardless of his moral unfitness. Even with testimony about abuse and evidence of trafficking, territorial courts were notoriously reluctant to override family authority without overwhelming proof of immediate danger. "That won't happen," Jacob replied, but Charlotte's expression showed she recognized the uncertainty behind his confident words. "You can't promise that," she said, displaying the practical wisdom that 4 days of terror had forced her to develop. "Adults have been making promises they couldn't keep for my entire life. What I need to know is what we do if the worst happens." The conversation that followed revealed Charlotte's remarkable capacity for strategic thinking, despite her youth. She had already considered escape routes, survival strategies, and ways to protect her younger sisters if legal protection failed. Her planning was methodical, desperate, and heartbreaking in its necessity. "There's another option," Jacob said. Finally, an idea forming that would require courage from all of them. Something that would make it impossible for Morrison or anyone like him to hurt you again, but it would mean trusting me completely. Charlotte studied his face with the careful evaluation of someone who had learned to read adult motivations quickly and accurately. "What kind of option?" "Adoption. Legal adoption through territorial court, making you my daughters in the eyes of the law. Morrison couldn't touch you, and no one could separate you from each other." The silence that followed was profound. Outside, evening shadows lengthened across Copper Ridge while inside the clinic, 4 sisters contemplated a possibility none of them had dared imagine: permanent safety with someone who had already proven his willingness to fight for their welfare. "Why would you do that?" Emily asked from the doorway, where she had been listening with Grace beside her. "We're not your responsibility. We're not even your family." Jacob considered the question seriously, knowing that his answer would be remembered for the rest of their lives. Because family isn't just about blood relations. It's about choosing to protect and support people who matter to you. "You girls matter to me now, and I want to make sure you have every opportunity to build the futures you deserve." Rose's small voice came from the cot where she was resting. "Would that mean we could stay together, always?" "Always," Jacob confirmed, and felt something shift in his chest as he realized he meant it completely. The decision to pursue adoption would prove far more complicated than any of them anticipated, setting in motion events that would test their determination, expose Morrison's broader network of criminal associates, and ultimately establish legal precedents protecting orphan children throughout the territory. But in that quiet moment in Dr. Whitfield's kitchen, what mattered was simpler. 4 sisters had found someone willing to fight for their right to safety, education, and the chance to determine their own destinies. The legal battle was just beginning. But Jacob Sullivan had made a commitment that would change all their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The territorial courthouse in Helena had seen many dramatic proceedings over the years, but few as contentious as the custody hearing that convened on a bitter November morning, 3 weeks after the rescue. Judge Thaddeus Morrison, no relation to Ezekiel, despite the unfortunate coincidence of names, presided over a courtroom packed with spectators, drawn by newspaper accounts of child trafficking and frontier justice that Jacob Sullivan sat at the plaintiff's table with attorney Rebecca Hayes, one of only 3 women licensed to practice law in Montana Territory. At 42, Rebecca had built her reputation defending the defenseless and challenging legal precedents that favored wealth over justice. Her decision to represent Jacob's adoption petition pro bono had surprised many, but those who knew her understood that cases involving child welfare brought out her most formidable advocacy skills. Across the aisle, Ezekiel Morrison huddled with Henderson Blackwood, whose expensive suit and gold watch chain marked him as legal counsel for clients with substantial resources. Blackwood's presence alone suggested that Morrison's backing came from sources far more powerful than a failed miner with gambling debts. Charlotte Brennan sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by her 3 sisters and Dr. Margaret Whitfield. At 17 now, her birthday had passed during the legal proceedings. Charlotte possessed a composure that impressed court observers, but masked deep anxiety about her family's future. Emily, Grace, and Rose had spent the intervening weeks at Jacob's ranch, experiencing safety and stability none of them had known since their parents' deaths, but the threat of being returned to Morrison haunted their daily existence. "Your Honor," Rebecca Hayes began, rising to address the court with the confident bearing that had intimidated opposing counsel throughout the territory. "This case represents more than a simple custody dispute. Evidence will show that Mr. Morrison operated a criminal enterprise that treated children as merchandise, and that his guardianship of the Brennan sisters was merely a legal cover for human trafficking." Henderson Blackwood's objection was swift and predictable. "Your Honor, counsel's inflammatory rhetoric cannot disguise the central issue. Mr. Morrison is the court-appointed guardian of these children, and Mr. Sullivan has no legal standing to challenge that authority based on unsubstantiated allegations." What followed was 3 days of testimony that exposed the systematic corruption underlying Morrison's operation. Reverend Walsh took the stand first, his detailed documentation providing a chronological account of Morrison's increasingly brazen statements about placing difficult children with families willing to pay for their services. "He told me directly that orphan children were a renewable resource," Walsh testified, his voice carrying the moral authority that had made him a respected community leader. He said conventional adoption was leaving money on the table when there were buyers willing to pay premium prices for specific types of children. Dr. Whitfield's medical testimony was devastating in its clinical precision. She described the sister's physical condition upon rescue, malnutrition, dehydration, and evidence of prolonged confinement that contradicted any claim of proper care. Rose's near-fatal pneumonia, she explained, resulted directly from exposure to cold, damp conditions that would have been lethal without immediate medical intervention, but the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Captain Thornton had continued investigating Morrison's associates after their arrest, and his findings revealed a network that extended across 4 territories. Financial records seized from Morrison's abandoned mine showed payments from buyers in San Francisco, Denver, and St. Louis, with detailed correspondence about specific orders for children of particular ages and characteristics. The defendants kept meticulous business records, Captain Thornton testified, producing ledgers that documented transactions stretching back 3 years. Each entry corresponds to a missing child report we've since matched with our investigation. 17 children in total, sold to establishments ranging from factories seeking small workers to brothels requiring young servants. Henderson Blackwood's cross-examination attempted to distance Morrison from his associates' activities, arguing that the financial records were forged or misinterpreted. But when Morrison himself took the stand in his own defense, his testimony revealed a man whose arrogance exceeded his intelligence. "Those girls were becoming unmanageable," Morrison declared, apparently believing honesty would strengthen his case. Charlotte was filling their heads with rebellious ideas, making them think they deserved better than honest work. "I was arranging proper placements where they could learn discipline and earn their keep." By proper placements, Rebecca Hayes pressed during cross-examination. "Do you mean the buyers who visited your home to examine the girls like livestock?" "I mean respectable establishments that would provide structure and employment," Morrison replied, oblivious to how his words sounded to the packed courtroom. "These girls come from nothing. They should be grateful for any opportunity to better themselves through hard work." Judge Morrison called a recess after Morrison's testimony, but not before several spectators had to be removed for disrupting proceedings with angry outbursts. The depth of public sentiment became clear as crowds gathered outside the courthouse, many carrying signs demanding justice for trafficked children and permanent protection for the Brennan sisters. Recess, Rebecca Hayes shared intelligence that would prove crucial to the case's outcome. Her contacts in the Territorial Attorney General's office had uncovered evidence linking Morrison's operation to a broader conspiracy involving territorial officials who had facilitated the trafficking network through legal and administrative cooperation. "Judge Blackwood in Silver City," she explained to Jacob in the courthouse corridor, "signed custody orders for 17 orphan children over the past 3 years, all transferred to Morrison's guardianship despite having no family connection. The Attorney General's office believes Blackwood was being paid to provide legal cover for the trafficking operation. The implications extended far beyond Morrison's individual crimes. If territorial judges were actively participating in child trafficking, the entire legal system's credibility was at stake. More immediately, it explained how Morrison had secured expensive legal representation. Despite his apparent poverty, his backers included officials whose own freedom depended on preventing exposure of their involvement. When proceedings resumed, Rebecca Hayes presented evidence that transformed the case from custody dispute to criminal conspiracy trial. Correspondence between Morrison and Judge Blackwood revealed explicit discussions about placing specific children with buyers who had made advance payments. The letters detailed arrangements for transferring custody without proper investigation of receiving families, with payments flowing to both Morrison and Blackwood for their cooperation. Henderson Blackwood's attempts to suppress this evidence failed when Judge Morrison ruled that criminal conspiracy evidence was relevant to determining the fitness of Morrison's guardianship. The ruling effectively ended Morrison's defense strategy and opened the door for testimony about the broader trafficking network. Samuel Red Hawk provided crucial evidence about Morrison's associates, having tracked their movements and documented their meetings with buyers from distant cities. His testimony revealed the sophisticated logistics behind the trafficking operation, advance payments, scheduled deliveries, and return transportation for buyers who traveled hundreds of miles to acquire specific children. They operated like a business, Samuel testified with characteristic precision, advertising through coded newspaper notices, maintaining customer lists, even offering guarantees that purchased children would not be traced back to buyers if questions arose. The network sophistication explained why Morrison had felt confident enough to operate openly in Copper Ridge. His backing came from officials who controlled the legal processes that might otherwise expose trafficking operations. Without Jacob's intervention and the subsequent investigation, the Brennan sisters would have disappeared into a system designed to erase their existence. Charlotte's testimony on the final day of proceedings provided the emotional climax that crystallized public sentiment. Speaking with poise that belied her youth, She described not just her family's ordeal, but her determination to ensure other children would not suffer similar fates. "Mr. Sullivan didn't just rescue us from my uncle," she told the packed courtroom. "He showed us that adults could be trusted to keep their promises, that we had value beyond what someone might pay for us, and that we deserved futures we could choose for ourselves. That's what real guardianship means, not ownership, but protection." When asked about her wishes regarding adoption, Charlotte's response resonated throughout the territory. "Mr. Sullivan has already been our father in every way that matters. Making it legal would just recognize what we all already know, that families are built on love and commitment, not just blood relations." Judge Morrison's ruling came after only 2 hours of deliberation. He granted Jacob's adoption petition unconditionally, terminated Ezekiel Morrison's guardianship permanently, and ordered Morrison held without bail pending trial on trafficking charges. More significantly, he issued judicial orders for investigating every custody transfer Judge Blackwood had approved, effectively exposing the entire corruption network. But the victory in court was only the beginning of a transformation that would extend far beyond the Brennan family. Public outrage over the trafficking revelations led to territorial legislation strengthening child protection laws, requiring independent oversight of custody decisions, and establishing penalties for officials who facilitated trafficking operations. Newspaper coverage of the trial spread awareness of child trafficking throughout the Western Territories, inspiring similar investigations in other jurisdictions. Within 6 months, congressional hearings were examining the scope of trafficking operations and proposing federal legislation to combat child exploitation. As they left the courthouse that evening, now legally a family, Jacob walked beside 4 daughters who carried themselves with the confidence of children who had survived the worst humanity could offer and emerged stronger. Charlotte's promise to protect other vulnerable children would prove prophetic in ways none of them yet understood. Legal battle was over, but their real work, building lives worthy of the sacrifice required to win them, was just beginning. The foundation they would build together would indeed change history, though not in ways anyone could have predicted during those dark days in Morrison's mine. The Brennan sisters were finally home, and their story of survival would inspire generations of children to believe that justice was possible, even when the entire system seemed aligned against them. Spring arrived at the Sullivan Ranch with an explosion of wildflowers that seemed to mirror the transformation taking place within its boundaries. 6 months after the adoption decree, the property had evolved from a successful cattle operation into something unprecedented in Montana Territory, a working ranch that doubled as an educational sanctuary for children who had nowhere else to turn. Charlotte Sullivan, now 18 and bearing her adoptive father's name with fierce pride, stood in the doorway of what had once been a storage barn and was now a fully equipped schoolhouse. Inside, 12 children ranging in age from 6 to 16 were engaged in lessons that would have impressed educators in eastern cities. Emily, now 15, had discovered a natural talent for mathematics that rivaled university students, while Grace's artistic abilities had blossomed into technical drawing skills that local engineers consulted for construction projects. Rose, though still the youngest at 9, possessed an uncanny ability to understand and calm troubled children who arrived at the ranch, carrying trauma that words couldn't express. Her gentle nature and innate wisdom had made her invaluable in helping new arrivals adjust to the radical concept that adults could be trusted, and that children's voices mattered. The transformation hadn't happened overnight or without considerable challenges. Jacob's decision to open his home to other vulnerable children had evolved naturally from the sisters' own healing process, but it required resources, legal arrangements, and community support that demanded constant navigation of territorial bureaucracy and social prejudices. Dr. Margaret Whitfield had become a crucial partner in the endeavor, providing medical care for children who arrived bearing physical and emotional scars from abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Her clinic now operated a satellite facility at the ranch, staffed by a young physician named Dr. Jonathan Mills, who had volunteered his services after reading newspaper accounts of the trafficking trials. We're seeing results that contradict everything conventional wisdom teaches about orphan children, Dr. Mills reported during a monthly review meeting in Jacob's study. The combination of educational opportunity, emotional security, and meaningful work responsibilities is producing remarkable development in children who were previously considered unadoptable by traditional standards. The ranch's educational program had attracted attention from progressive educators throughout the territory. Professor Catherine Wells from the University of Chicago had traveled west specifically to study their methods after hearing reports of 8-year-old children learning advanced mathematics and teenagers conducting scientific experiments that contributed to actual agricultural research. "You're not just educating these children," Professor Wells observed during her week-long visit. "You're demonstrating that intelligence and capability aren't distributed according to social class or family background." The implications for educational theory are revolutionary. Charlotte had emerged as the ranch's unofficial coordinator, her natural leadership abilities refined by experiences that had forced her to mature far beyond her chronological age. She maintained correspondence with child welfare advocates across multiple territories, sharing information about trafficking investigations and lobbying for legislative reforms that would prevent other children from suffering as her family had. Letters to territorial legislators were models of persuasive writing that impressed recipients with their sophisticated understanding of legal procedures and social policy. When Territorial Representative James Morrison, ironically sharing a surname with their former tormentor, visited the ranch to observe their operations firsthand, Charlotte's presentation of child welfare proposals left him genuinely amazed. "Miss Sullivan," he said after reviewing her detailed recommendations for territorial child protection laws, "your analysis of legislative mechanisms and enforcement strategies rivals work produced by my most experienced staff members. Have you considered pursuing legal education?" The suggestion opened possibilities that Charlotte had never dared imagine. Women's access to legal education remains severely limited throughout the territory, but Professor Wells's connections with progressive Eastern institutions suggested pathways that could circumvent traditional barriers. Emily's mathematical gifts had taken a different but equally remarkable direction. Her calculations had helped optimize the ranch's agricultural output to levels that attracted attention from territorial agricultural agents. More significantly, her statistical analysis of trafficking patterns had provided law enforcement with investigative tools that led to the discovery of 3 additional criminal networks operating in neighboring territories. She's identified correlations between economic conditions, legal loopholes, and trafficking activity that our experienced investigators missed, Captain Thornton admitted during one of his regular visits to review ongoing cases. Her work has directly contributed to rescuing 26 children in the past 4 months. Grace's artistic talents had evolved into technical skills that served both practical and investigative purposes. Her detailed illustrations of the conditions at Morrison's mine had been used as evidence in multiple court proceedings, while her maps of trafficking routes had helped law enforcement understand the scope and logistics of criminal operations. Perhaps more importantly, Grace had begun creating art that helped other traumatized children process their experiences safely. Her gentle drawings depicting healing, growth, and hope adorned the walls of the ranch's residential buildings, providing visual representations of possibility for children who had known only despair. Rose's unique ability to connect with troubled children had led to the development of peer support programs that paired newly arrived children with those further along in their recovery. Her instinctive understanding of trauma responses had proven more effective than traditional adult interventions. In many cases, she sees what adults miss, Dr. Mills observed after watching Rose help a 6-year-old boy overcome his terror of enclosed spaces. Children who have been betrayed by adults often trust other children more readily, and Rose has an extraordinary gift for conveying safety without triggering defensive responses. The ranch's success had attracted financial support from unexpected sources. Wealthy Eastern philanthropists, motivated by newspaper coverage of the trafficking trials and impressed by reports of the educational results, had begun contributing funds that allowed expansion of both facilities and programs. Mrs. Elizabeth Carnegie, widow of a steel magnate and advocate for women's education, had pledged funding for a permanent school building designed specifically for innovative educational methods. Her visit to the ranch in late spring resulted in commitments that would allow the program to serve 50 children within 2 years. What you're accomplishing here contradicts every assumption about the limitations of charitable education, Mrs. Carnegie told Jacob during her tour of the facilities. These children aren't just surviving their circumstances, they're exceeding expectations that would challenge students from privileged backgrounds. But the ranch's influence extended beyond individual success stories. The legislative reforms Charlotte had helped draft were being adopted throughout the territory, creating legal frameworks that made trafficking operations far more difficult to operate. The precedents established during Morrison's trial had strengthened child protection laws in ways that would benefit generations of vulnerable children. Samuel Red Hawk had become the ranch's unofficial security coordinator, training older children in skills that would help them recognize and avoid dangerous situations. His lessons covered everything from reading adult motivations to understanding legal rights, providing practical knowledge that could prevent future victimization. Children who understand their own worth and know their rights are harder targets for exploitation, Samuel explained to visitors who questioned the wisdom of teaching children about such dark realities. Knowledge is protection, and these children have earned the right to protect themselves. The community's initial skepticism about Jacob's unconventional approach had gradually transformed into admiration and support. Local businesses began offering apprenticeships to older children, while families started requesting tutoring services from the ranch's advanced students. The economic benefits of educating previously overlooked children were becoming apparent even to those who had initially opposed the program. Tom Bradley, Jacob's foreman, had witnessed the transformation from working cattle ranch to educational sanctuary with amazement that never diminished. "I've seen a lot of changes in 30 years of ranch work," he told visitors, "but nothing like watching throwaway children become leaders and innovators. It changes how you think about human potential." As summer approached, Charlotte was preparing for examinations that would determine her acceptance to law school, an opportunity made possible by Professor Wells's advocacy and Mrs. Carnegie's financial support. Emily had received invitations to participate in advanced mathematics programs at universities that had never before considered applicants of her background. Grace's artwork was being displayed in galleries that showcased it as examples of frontier artistic expression, while Rose had become the subject of academic studies, examining her natural therapeutic abilities. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in Jacob himself. The successful rancher who had rescued 4 desperate children had evolved into an educator, advocate, and social reformer whose influence extended far beyond Montana territory. His methods were being studied, his results were being replicated, and his vision of education as a tool for social justice was inspiring similar programs throughout the American West. "I thought I was saving 4 children," Jacob reflected during an evening conversation with Charlotte as they reviewed plans for the new school building. "I didn't realize they would end up saving hundreds of others, or that they would change how an entire territory thinks about the potential of every child." Charlotte smiled with the confidence of someone who had discovered her own strength through adversity. "You gave us the chance to become who we were meant to be. Now we're making sure other children get the same chance." The ranch that had begun as a refuge was becoming a revolution, one that would indeed change history by proving that every child, regardless of background or circumstances, possessed unlimited potential when given genuine opportunity and unwavering support. The foundation they were building would outlast all of them, creating ripple effects that would transform educational philosophy, child welfare policy, and social justice advocacy for generations to come. The work was far from finished, but the transformation was undeniable. 4 sisters who had once faced sale into slavery were now preparing to change the world. 2 years after the adoption decree, Charlotte Sullivan stood before the Montana Territorial Legislature as the youngest person ever to address the assembled representatives. At 20, she possessed the poise of someone twice her age and the passionate conviction of an advocate who had lived the consequences of the laws she sought to change. In the gallery behind her, Jacob watched with pride as his eldest daughter prepared to deliver testimony that would reshape child welfare policy across the American West. "Honorable Representatives," Charlotte began, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, "I stand before you not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a citizen demanding justice for children who cannot speak for themselves. The evidence I present today demonstrates that our current legal framework not only fails to protect vulnerable children, it actively enables their exploitation." The comprehensive report Charlotte had prepared, with assistance from Emily's statistical analysis and documentation from cases throughout the territory, revealed systematic failures that extended far beyond individual tragedies. Her research had uncovered a pattern of judicial corruption, administrative negligence, and legal loopholes that had facilitated trafficking operations in 12 different counties. Representative Harrison Caldwell, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Miss Sullivan, your preliminary findings suggest involvement by territorial officials at multiple levels. These are serious allegations requiring substantial evidence." Charlotte's response demonstrated the thoroughness that had impressed Professor Wells and earned her early admission to Columbia Law School, an opportunity she had deferred to complete her advocacy work in Montana. "Honorable Representatives, I submit exhibits documenting 47 cases where custody transfers occurred without proper investigation, 17 instances where missing children reports were suppressed or ignored, and documented correspondence between officials and known trafficking operations." The evidence Charlotte presented over the following 3 hours painted a disturbing picture of systematic corruption that had operated with impunity for over a decade. Her testimony revealed how Judge Blackwood's network had extended into administrative offices, sheriff departments, and even territorial social services, creating a comprehensive system for identifying, acquiring, and selling vulnerable children. Emily's mathematical analysis had provided the statistical foundation that transformed anecdotal evidence into irrefutable proof of institutional failure. Her calculations showed that child disappearance rates in counties with corrupt officials were 8 times higher than the territorial average, while survival rates for children in state custody varied dramatically based on the integrity of local administrators. The data reveals patterns that no honest system could produce by coincidence. Emily testified when called to support her sister's presentation. Children were systematically channeled toward officials who had financial incentives to approve questionable custody arrangements, while protective services were consistently understaffed in areas where trafficking operations were most active. The legislative session that followed Charlotte's testimony became known as the Children's Protection Session, producing the most comprehensive child welfare reforms in territorial history. The Sullivan Act, named in honor of the 4 sisters, established mandatory oversight for all custody decisions, created independent investigative authority for child welfare cases, and imposed severe penalties for officials who facilitated trafficking operations. But the sisters' influence extended far beyond legislative chambers. Grace's artistic documentation of trafficking operations had been compiled into an illustrated report that, was distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the Western Territories. Her detailed drawings of hidden compartments, modified wagons, and secret holding facilities had helped investigators identify and dismantle operations they might otherwise have missed. Visual evidence often reveals details that written reports overlook. Captain Thornton explained during a regional law enforcement conference where Grace's work was featured prominently. Miss Sullivan's artistic training allows her to observe and document architectural features, transportation modifications, and concealment methods that have proven crucial in multiple investigations. Grace had also begun training other young people in documentary illustration techniques, creating a network of observers who could provide law enforcement with detailed visual intelligence about suspected criminal operations. Her students, many of them children rescued from trafficking situations, possessed intimate knowledge of how such operations functioned, and unique ability to recognize signs that adults might miss. Rose's therapeutic work had evolved into a formal peer counseling program that was being studied by physicians and social reformers throughout the territory. At 11, she had developed techniques for helping traumatized children that produced results faster and more effectively than traditional adult interventions. Dr. Mills had documented Rose's methods in medical journals, describing how her intuitive understanding of trauma responses had led to breakthrough treatments for conditions that had previously been considered untreatable. "She doesn't just comfort frightened children," he wrote in the Territorial Medical Review. "She helps them rediscover their own strength and agency in ways that restore not just emotional stability, but fundamental trust in human relationships." The peer counseling program had become so successful that other territories were sending delegations to study Rose's techniques. Representatives from Colorado, Wyoming, and Dakota territories had visited the ranch to observe her work and learn methods they could implement in their own jurisdictions. Meanwhile, Jacob's Ranch had become an informal headquarters for child welfare reform throughout the Mountain West. Legislators, law enforcement officials, and social reformers made regular pilgrimages to observe the educational methods and social programs that were producing unprecedented results with children who had been written off by conventional institutions. The financial sustainability of the ranch's programs had been secured through a combination of territorial funding, private philanthropy, and income generated by the students' own productive work. Emily's mathematical consulting had become profitable enough to support 3 full-time teachers, while Grace's artistic commissions provided funds for art supplies and specialized equipment. Charlotte's legal research services were in demand from attorneys throughout the territory who needed assistance with complex child welfare cases. Her combination of legal knowledge, investigative skills, and personal experience with trafficking operations made her invaluable in cases involving exploitation or abuse. She understands both the legal technicalities and the human realities in ways that allow her to build cases that courts can't ignore. Attorney Rebecca Hayes explained to colleagues who sought Charlotte's assistance. Her work has contributed to conviction rates in trafficking cases that are 3 times higher than the territorial average. The ranch's educational program had produced results that challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence, capability, and social mobility. Students who had arrived as traumatized, uneducated children were being accepted into universities, apprenticed to skilled professionals, and recruited by businesses that recognized the value of employees who combined technical competence with unshakable work ethic. Samuel Red Hawk had documented the program's outcomes in reports that were circulated among tribal councils and territorial education departments. His analysis showed that children from the ranch consistently outperformed their peers from conventional schools in both academic achievement and practical problem-solving abilities. Education that connects learning to real-world application produces citizens who can think independently and act effectively. Samuel explained to visitors who questioned the ranch's unconventional methods These children aren't just memorizing facts, they're developing the intellectual tools they need to shape their own futures and contribute to their communities. The broader social impact of the sisters' work was becoming apparent throughout Montana Territory. Communities that had once ignored child welfare issues were establishing oversight committees and reporting procedures. Businesses were implementing policies to identify and assist exploited children. Even churches were organizing programs to provide sanctuary and support for vulnerable youth. Dr. Whitfield had expanded her medical practice to include specialized training for physicians who worked with trafficking victims. Her protocols for treating trauma-related health issues were being adopted by medical schools and published in journals that reached practitioners throughout the developing territories. The Sullivan sisters have demonstrated that survivors of severe trauma can become leaders in preventing similar tragedies. Dr. Whitfield wrote in her landmark paper on trauma recovery. Their transformation from victims to advocates represents a new model for understanding resilience and the potential for post-traumatic growth. As autumn approached, Charlotte was preparing for her delayed entrance to Columbia Law School, where she planned to focus on child welfare law and criminal justice reform. Emily had accepted a scholarship to study mathematics at the University of Chicago, while Grace had been invited to participate in an advanced art program that would prepare her for teaching and therapeutic applications of artistic expression. Rose, though still young, had been invited to participate in research studies examining her natural therapeutic abilities. Leading physicians wanted to understand how her techniques could be systematized and taught to other counselors working with traumatized children. But perhaps the most significant achievement was the transformation of Montana Territory's entire approach to child welfare. The Sullivan Act had become a model for legislation in other territories, while the ranch's educational methods were being replicated in institutions throughout the Mountain West. 4 years ago, these girls faced sale into slavery, Jacob reflected during an interview with a journalist documenting the territorial transformation. Today, they're recognized as experts whose work is protecting hundreds of other children and influencing policy at the highest levels of government. It demonstrates what becomes possible when society invests in every child's potential rather than writing off those who face difficult circumstances. The sisters' influence was spreading beyond Montana Territory through correspondence networks, professional conferences, and academic publications. Their story had become a symbol of hope for advocates working to protect vulnerable children, while their methods were being studied and adapted by reformers throughout the expanding nation. As they prepared to take their individual paths toward advanced education and specialized careers, the 4 sisters had already established legacies that would outlast their lifetimes. They had proven that children dismissed by society as damaged goods could become leaders, innovators, and reformers whose contributions enriched entire communities. The ranch that had begun as a refuge for 4 desperate girls had become a laboratory for social transformation, generating ideas, methods, and policies that were reshaping how America understood child welfare, education, and human potential. Their work was far from finished, but the foundation they had built was already supporting structures that would protect and empower generations of children yet to come. The gentle rancher who had rescued them had indeed given them something that changed history, not just their own lives, but the entire trajectory of child protection in the American West. 5 years after the rescue that had transformed 4 desperate children into territorial advocates, the influence of the Sullivan sisters reached far beyond Montana's borders. Charlotte's graduation from Columbia Law School had been covered by newspapers from San Francisco to New York, not merely as a human interest story, but as a significant development in the emerging field of child welfare law. At 23, she had already argued 3 cases before territorial supreme courts and established legal precedents that protected vulnerable children across the American West. The law office Charlotte opened in Helena became the first practice in Montana Territory dedicated exclusively to child advocacy. Her client list included not just individual families seeking protection, but territorial governments requesting policy consultation and federal investigators pursuing interstate trafficking cases. The skills she had developed through necessity as a 16-year-old protecting her sisters had evolved into expertise that commanded respect from seasoned attorneys and judges throughout the region. Miss Sullivan's legal briefs demonstrate an understanding of both constitutional law and practical enforcement challenges that most experienced practitioners never achieve. Federal prosecutor Jonathan Hartwell commented after Charlotte's successful argument in a case involving trafficking across territorial lines. Her combination of academic training and personal experience with these crimes makes her uniquely qualified to design legal frameworks that actually work. Emily's mathematical genius had taken an unexpected direction that surprised even her strongest supporters. After completing her degree at the University of Chicago in record time, she had been recruited by the newly formed Treasury Department's Statistical Analysis Division to develop methods for tracking financial crimes across vast distances. Her work on identifying patterns in economic data had led to breakthroughs in detecting criminal enterprises that operated across multiple territories. The techniques Emily developed for analyzing trafficking networks had applications far beyond child welfare cases. Her mathematical models were being used to track cattle rustling, bank fraud, and other criminal activities that exploited the limited communication and coordination between law enforcement agencies in different regions. Emily Sullivan's statistical methods have revolutionized our ability to identify and pursue criminal enterprises that operate on a territorial scale, Treasury Department Chief William McKenzie reported to Congress. Her work has directly contributed to recovering over $200,000 in stolen assets and dismantling crime syndicates that had operated with impunity for years. But Emily's most significant contribution remained her development of data collection systems that tracked child welfare outcomes across the territories. Her statistical analysis had become the foundation for federal legislation requiring standardized reporting of child custody decisions, missing children reports, and trafficking investigations. Grace's artistic talents had evolved into pioneering work in what would later be called forensic illustration. Her detailed drawings of crime scenes, trafficking methods, and witness testimony had become crucial evidence in dozens of court cases. More importantly, her development of techniques for helping traumatized children communicate through art had established entirely new approaches to investigating crimes against minors. The Grace Sullivan method, as it came to be known in law enforcement circles, involved using art supplies and gentle encouragement to help child witnesses express experiences they couldn't verbalize. Her techniques had led to breakthroughs in cases where traditional interrogation methods had failed to elicit useful information from traumatized children. Grace Sullivan has given us tools for accessing information that was previously lost forever. Captain Thornton explained to a conference of regional law enforcement officials. Children who couldn't or wouldn't speak about their experiences could draw them, providing evidence that has been crucial in convicting traffickers and identifying their networks. Grace had also established the first school in the territories, dedicated to training therapeutic artists, individuals who combined artistic skills with understanding of trauma recovery to help victims process their experiences safely. Students from as far away as California traveled to Montana to learn her methods, which were being adopted by hospitals, courts, and social service agencies throughout the developing West. Rose's natural therapeutic abilities had been formalized through collaboration with leading physicians and psychology researchers. At 15, she had become the subject of academic studies examining her intuitive understanding of trauma responses and her remarkable success in helping other children overcome severe psychological damage. Dr. Hamilton Reed from Harvard Medical School had spent 6 months at the ranch studying Rose's techniques, documenting methods that produced recovery rates far exceeding anything achieved through conventional treatment. His published research on the Rose Sullivan approach had attracted attention from medical professionals throughout the nation. Rose Sullivan has developed therapeutic interventions through pure intuition that our most advanced medical training struggles to replicate. Dr. Reed wrote in the Journal of American Medicine, her success rates with severely traumatized children represent a paradigm shift in our understanding of healing and resilience. Rose's work had led to the establishment of peer counseling programs in 12 territories, all based on methods she had developed through trial and error while helping children who arrived at the ranch. Her techniques were being taught to social workers, teachers, and even parents who needed tools for helping children overcome trauma. The ranch itself had evolved into something unprecedented in American social history, a combination research institute, educational laboratory, and operational model that was being studied and replicated throughout the rapidly expanding territories. Delegations arrived monthly from other regions seeking to understand and adapt the methods that had produced such remarkable results. Jacob Sullivan had been invited to testify before congressional committees, examining the effectiveness of different approaches to child welfare and education. His testimony about the ranch's methods and outcomes had influenced federal legislation establishing standards for territorial child protection services. The Sullivan Ranch demonstrates that investing in the potential of every child, regardless of their background or circumstances, produces citizens who contribute far more to society than the resources invested in their development. Jacob told the House Committee on Territorial Affairs, "These children aren't just surviving difficult beginnings, they're becoming leaders who strengthen their entire communities." The financial sustainability of the ranch's programs had been secured through a combination of federal grants, private donations, and income generated by the students' own work. The therapeutic art program Grace had developed was generating enough commission income to support expanded facilities, while Emily's consulting work with government agencies provided funding for advanced mathematical equipment and additional teachers. Charlotte's legal practice had become profitable enough to establish an endowment that would ensure the ranch's educational programs could continue indefinitely. More importantly, her successful court cases had generated legal precedents that protected children throughout the territories, creating a legacy that extended far beyond individual rescue operations. Samuel Red Hawk had documented the long-term outcomes of the ranch's first graduates, tracking their achievements and contributions to their communities. His research showed that children who had completed the ranch's programs were establishing businesses, entering professions, and taking leadership roles in their communities at rates that far exceeded territorial averages. Education that treats every child as capable of extraordinary achievement produces extraordinary results, Samuel reported to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was studying the ranch's methods for possible application in tribal schools. These children aren't just recovering from trauma, they're using their experiences to build strength and develop capabilities that benefit everyone around them. The sisters' influence had begun extending beyond American territories, through correspondence with social reformers in other countries. Charlotte's legal writings were being translated into multiple languages, while Emily's statistical methods were being adapted for use in European cities dealing with similar child welfare challenges. Grace's therapeutic art techniques had attracted attention from physicians in London and Vienna who were struggling to treat children traumatized by industrial accidents and urban poverty. Her illustrated guides to helping traumatized children were being distributed internationally through medical networks. Rose's peer counseling methods were being studied by researchers in Germany and France, who were investigating innovative approaches to treating psychological trauma. Her techniques were particularly relevant for societies dealing with large numbers of displaced children, affected by political upheaval and economic disruption. The broader social transformation the sisters had catalyzed was becoming apparent. Throughout the Mountain West, communities that had once ignored child welfare issues were establishing protection programs and reporting systems. The territorial legislation they had influenced was being adopted by other regions, creating a network of legal protections that made trafficking operations increasingly difficult to sustain. Dr. Margaret Whitfield had been appointed to the Territorial Board of Health, where she used her position to establish medical protocols for treating trafficking victims and training physicians in trauma-informed care. Her work had directly contributed to saving hundreds of children who might otherwise have suffered permanent physical and psychological damage. The Sullivan sisters proved that society's most vulnerable children often possess the greatest potential for transformative leadership. Dr. Whitfield explained to a medical conference examining innovative approaches to trauma treatment. Their achievements demonstrate that investing in healing and education for traumatized children produces benefits that extend throughout entire communities. As the sisters prepared for the next phases of their individual careers, their collective influence continued expanding. Charlotte's legal expertise was being sought by federal prosecutors pursuing trafficking cases across multiple states. Emily's mathematical innovations were being incorporated into federal law enforcement training programs. Grace's therapeutic techniques were being taught in medical schools, while Rose's counseling methods were being adopted by social service agencies nationwide. The transformation that had begun with a furious rancher's decision to rescue 4 desperate children had evolved into a movement that was reshaping American society's approach to child welfare, education, and social justice. Their work had demonstrated that every child, regardless of their circumstances, possessed unlimited potential when given genuine opportunity and unwavering support. The network of change they had initiated was now self-sustaining, generating new innovations, protecting vulnerable children, and inspiring advocates throughout the rapidly expanding nation. Their story had become proof that individual acts of courage could indeed change the course of history, creating ripple effects that would benefit generations yet to come. 10 years after their rescue from Morrison's mine, the Sullivan sisters found themselves facing a challenge that would test everything they had built and learned. A telegram arrived at the ranch on a cold February morning in 1898, carrying news that would transform their local success into a national mission. The message came from President William McKinley himself, requesting their immediate assistance. With a crisis that threatened to overwhelm the federal government's newly established Child Protection Services, the Spanish-American War had created an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. Thousands of children had been orphaned or displaced by the conflict, while profiteering criminals had seized the opportunity to exploit the chaos for trafficking operations that dwarfed anything the sisters had previously encountered. The federal government, unprepared for the scale of the crisis, was struggling to protect vulnerable children while managing military operations and territorial administration. Charlotte, now 26 and recognized as the nation's leading expert on child welfare law, received a personal summons from Attorney General John Griggs to lead a federal task force investigating trafficking networks that were operating with impunity in the confusion of wartime. Her reputation for building cases that courts couldn't ignore had reached the highest levels of government. Miss Sullivan, the Attorney General's letter explained, preliminary investigations suggest trafficking operations involving thousands of children across multiple states and territories. We need someone with your unique combination of legal expertise and investigative experience to coordinate a response that can match the scope of these crimes. Emily's statistical analysis capabilities had become legendary within government circles after her work exposing financial corruption in territorial administrations. The Treasury Department requested her immediate deployment to analyze patterns in wartime trafficking that conventional investigators had failed to detect. Her mathematical models had proven capable of identifying criminal networks that operated across vast distances and multiple jurisdictions. The data Emily uncovered painted a terrifying picture of systematic exploitation. Criminal organizations were using wartime disruption to acquire children from refugee camps, military orphanages, and displaced families, then transporting them through networks that stretched from Cuba to California. Her calculations suggested that over 15,000 children had been trafficked since the war began, with operations generating profits that rivaled major industrial enterprises. The scale of this criminal enterprise exceeds anything we've encountered in peacetime, Emily reported to federal investigators. These organizations are using military transportation routes, exploiting communication breakdowns between agencies, and taking advantage of legal jurisdictional confusion to operate what amounts to a continental trafficking system. Grace's forensic illustration skills had become essential tools for federal law enforcement, but the wartime crisis demanded innovations that pushed her artistic techniques into uncharted territory. The War Department requested her assistance in documenting conditions in refugee facilities and military orphanages where children were disappearing at alarming rates. The drawings Grace produced from her investigations revealed systematic negligence and corruption that reached into the highest levels of military administration. Her illustrations of overcrowded facilities, inadequate supervision, and suspicious visitors provided visual evidence that sparked congressional investigations and military court-martial proceedings. Grace Sullivan's documentation has exposed failures in our military child protection protocols that could have continued indefinitely without visual evidence, General Leonard Wood reported to the War Department. Her work has been instrumental in identifying security vulnerabilities that criminal organizations were exploiting to access military facilities. But Grace's most important contribution was developing rapid assessment techniques that could identify trafficked children in large refugee populations. Her artistic methods for helping traumatized children communicate had evolved into screening procedures that military personnel could use to distinguish between legitimate orphans and victims of trafficking operations. Rose, now 18 and possessing therapeutic abilities that amazed medical professionals, was deployed to military hospitals where traumatized children were recovering from experiences that defied conventional treatment approaches. Her peer counseling techniques had proven more effective than traditional medical interventions for helping severely damaged children regain the ability to trust and communicate. The children Rose encountered in military facilities had been subjected to trauma that exceeded even her previous experience. Many had been trafficked multiple times, passed between different criminal organizations, and exposed to violence that had left them virtually mute with terror. Her gentle methods for reaching these children became crucial tools for gathering intelligence about trafficking networks. Rose Sullivan can establish communication with children who haven't spoken in months. Dr. Marcus Webb, Chief Medical Officer for Military Orphanages, reported to his superiors. Her techniques have been essential in gathering information about trafficking operations that we couldn't obtain through any other means. The federal task force Charlotte assembled included investigators, attorneys, and military personnel from across the nation. But the core team remained the Sullivan sisters, working with coordination that reflected their years of collaboration. Their complementary skills, Charlotte's legal expertise, Emily's statistical analysis, Grace's visual documentation, and Rose's therapeutic intervention, created investigative capabilities that no conventional law enforcement agency could match. Jacob Sullivan found himself appointed as civilian coordinator for the federal operation. His experience managing complex multi-agency cooperation at the ranch making him invaluable for organizing a response that involved military, civilian, and territorial authorities. The administrative skills he had developed overseeing the ranch's expansion proved essential for coordinating operations across multiple states and territories. Jacob Sullivan understands how to make different organizations work together toward common goals. Federal Coordinator James Harrison explained to skeptical military officials. His experience managing civilian-military cooperation during territorial child welfare operations makes him uniquely qualified to lead this multi-agency response. The investigation that followed revealed criminal networks of staggering sophistication and reach. Trafficking organizations had established operations in major port cities, military supply centers, and refugee processing facilities. They were using forged documents, corrupted officials, and military transportation to move children across continental distances with efficiency that impressed even federal investigators. Charlotte's legal analysis revealed how traffickers were exploiting gaps between federal, state, and military jurisdiction to operate in legal gray areas where prosecution was nearly impossible. Her recommendations for closing these loopholes led to emergency legislation that strengthened federal authority over crimes involving children in military zones and territorial areas. Emily's statistical work identified patterns that revealed the true scope of the trafficking networks. Her calculations showed that criminal organizations were treating child trafficking as a systematic business operation, with advance orders from buyers, scheduled delivery routes, and financial arrangements that generated predictable revenue streams. These aren't opportunistic criminals taking advantage of wartime chaos, Emily reported to federal prosecutors. These are sophisticated business enterprises that have invested substantial resources in developing reliable supply chains for human trafficking. They're operating with the efficiency and organization of major corporations. Grace's documentation provided visual evidence that proved crucial in congressional hearings, examining military failures to protect vulnerable children. Her illustrations of trafficking routes, hidden facilities, and modified transportation vehicles gave lawmakers concrete evidence of systematic problems that required immediate legislative response. Rose's therapeutic work with rescued children provided intelligence that led to the identification and arrest of trafficking leaders who had operated with impunity for years. The children she helped recover their voices provided testimony that exposed corruption extending into federal agencies, military commands, and territorial administrations. The scale of the crisis demanded innovative solutions that challenged conventional approaches to law enforcement and child protection. The Sullivan sisters found themselves creating new methods for investigation, prosecution, and victim assistance that would become standard procedures for federal agencies dealing with large-scale criminal enterprises. Charlotte's legal strategies for prosecuting trafficking cases involved coordinating between multiple jurisdictions while building evidence that could withstand challenges from expensive defense attorneys. Her approaches to witness protection and victim advocacy established precedents that protected vulnerable children while ensuring successful prosecutions. Emily's development of centralized data collection systems allowed federal agencies to track criminal activities across state and territorial boundaries for the first time. Her statistical models became templates for analyzing other types of interstate criminal enterprises, revolutionizing federal law enforcement capabilities. Grace's rapid assessment techniques for identifying trafficked children were adopted by military and civilian agencies as standard procedures for processing large refugee populations. Her methods for documenting criminal activities became essential tools for federal investigators pursuing complex cases. Rose's therapeutic interventions with severely traumatized children established new approaches to victim assistance that recognized the importance of emotional healing in successful prosecution of trafficking cases. Her techniques for helping children regain their voices became crucial elements in federal victim assistance programs. The wartime crisis was testing not just their individual abilities, but the entire network of reforms and institutions they had spent years building. The methods developed at the ranch, the legal precedents Charlotte had established, and the therapeutic techniques the sisters had pioneered were being scaled up to address challenges of unprecedented magnitude. As winter turned to spring, in 1898, the Sullivan sisters were coordinating a federal response to child trafficking that involved hundreds of investigators, dozens of military units, and legal proceedings in multiple states. Their success or failure would determine not just the fate of thousands of trafficked children, but the future of federal child protection policy throughout the rapidly expanding American empire. The gentle rancher's decision to rescue 4 desperate children had evolved into a national mission that would define America's approach to protecting its most vulnerable citizens for generations to come. 25 years had passed since that desperate night when Jacob Sullivan found 4 terrified sisters huddled in an abandoned mine, and the America of 1912 bore little resemblance to the lawless territory where children could disappear without consequence. Standing before the newly constructed Federal Bureau of Child Protection in Washington, D.C., Charlotte Sullivan Hayes watched as President William Howard Taft signed into law the comprehensive child welfare legislation that would become known as the Sullivan Doctrine, the most sweeping protection framework in the nation's history. The building itself stood as a monument to transformation. Where once scattered territorial agencies had struggled to coordinate basic child protection services, now stood a unified federal institution with offices in every state, standardized procedures for investigating abuse, and enforcement authority that crossed all jurisdictional boundaries. The marble inscription above the entrance read simply, "In protection of every child's tomorrow." Charlotte, now 43 and recently appointed as the first director of federal child advocacy, had spent the morning reviewing statistics that would have seemed impossible during those dark days in Montana Territory. Child trafficking prosecutions had increased by 400% over the past decade, while conviction rates approached 95% thanks to investigative methods pioneered during the wartime crisis. More importantly, the number of missing children had dropped to historic lows as prevention programs eliminated the conditions that made trafficking profitable. Mrs. Hayes, President Taft addressed her during the signing ceremony, using the married name she had taken after wedding fellow attorney Thomas Hayes in 1905. "Your work has fundamentally changed how America protects its children. The methods you and your sisters developed have become the international standard for child welfare." The international recognition was well-deserved. Emily's statistical techniques were being used by law enforcement agencies across Europe to track criminal enterprises, while Grace's therapeutic art methods had been adopted by hospitals and schools on 6 continents. Rose's peer counseling approaches had become standard training for social workers worldwide, with the Rose Sullivan Institute in Geneva serving as the global center for trauma recovery research. Emily Sullivan Chun had married brilliant mathematician Dr. David Chun in 1908, and together they had established the Statistical Analysis Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Their work had expanded far beyond criminal investigation to include public health research, economic modeling, and social policy analysis. The mathematical frameworks Emily developed for tracking child trafficking had revolutionized how governments understood and responded to complex social problems. Emily's work demonstrated that human suffering could be measured, analyzed, and systematically addressed through scientific methodology. Dr. Chun explained to the assembled dignitaries, "Her statistical models have prevented more crime than all the police forces in America combined, simply by making criminal enterprises unprofitable through predictable enforcement." The Emily Sullivan method had become required coursework in universities throughout the world, teaching students how mathematical analysis could reveal patterns hidden within social chaos. Her textbook, Statistical Approaches to Social Justice, was considered the foundational text for a new field that combined mathematics with humanitarian advocacy. Grace Sullivan Morrison had married Dr. Samuel Morrison, a physician who shared her passion for therapeutic innovation, and together they had established the National Institute for Therapeutic Arts. Grace's techniques for helping traumatized children communicate through creative expression had evolved into comprehensive treatment programs that serve thousands of patients annually. The Grace Sullivan Galleries, established in major cities across America, displayed not just artistic works but educational exhibits that taught the general public to recognize signs of child abuse and trafficking. Her illustrated guides for identifying exploitation had become standard materials for teachers, medical professionals, and community leaders. Grace Sullivan Morrison has given society tools for seeing what was previously invisible, Dr. Morrison told the gathered crowd. Her work has taught millions of people to recognize suffering that children couldn't verbalize, creating a network of protection that extends throughout every community in America. Rose Sullivan had chosen never to marry, dedicating her life entirely to the children who needed her unique therapeutic gifts. At 35, she had become the world's leading expert on trauma recovery, with the Rose Sullivan Foundation operating programs in 43 countries. Her techniques had helped over 50,000 children recover from experiences that would have destroyed previous generations. The Rose Sullivan Centers, located in major cities worldwide, provided both direct therapeutic services and training for professionals who worked with traumatized children. Her approach to healing, which emphasized restoring children's sense of agency and self-worth, rather than just treating symptoms, had fundamentally changed how society understood trauma recovery. Rose Sullivan has demonstrated that the human capacity for healing extends far beyond what medical science previously believed possible, explained Dr. Frederick Watson, director of the National Institute of Mental Health. Her work has shown that children who experience the worst humanity can often develop the greatest capacity for compassion and leadership. Jacob Sullivan, now 68, had been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contributions to child welfare and social reform. The ranch in Montana had evolved into the Sullivan Institute for Social Innovation, a research and training center that attracted scholars, policymakers, and advocates from around the world. Students who graduated from its programs were establishing similar institutions throughout the expanding nation. Jacob Sullivan proved that individual courage, when combined with systematic effort and unwavering commitment, could indeed change the world, President Taft declared during the medal ceremony. His decision to rescue 4 children led to the transformation of American child welfare policy and inspired similar reforms throughout the civilized world. The statistics told a remarkable story of transformation. In 1887, an estimated 50,000 children disappeared annually in America with virtually no government response. By 1912, fewer than 500 children went missing each year, and 95% were recovered within 48 hours through coordinated search procedures. Child trafficking had been reduced from a thriving industry to isolated criminal enterprises that faced swift, certain prosecution. The Sullivan Doctrine established comprehensive federal authority over child protection, standardized investigation procedures, mandatory reporting requirements, and victim assistance programs that ensured no child would suffer alone. The legislation represented the culmination of 25 years of advocacy, legal innovation, and systematic reform, but perhaps the most significant achievement was the transformation of American society's understanding of children's potential. The ranch's educational programs had demonstrated that every child, regardless of background or circumstances, possessed capabilities that could benefit entire communities when properly developed. This philosophy had spread throughout the nation's schools, creating educational approaches that emphasized individual potential rather than social expectations. Samuel Red Hawk, now serving as director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs Education Division, had documented the long-term outcomes of students who had passed through Sullivan programs. Their achievements had shattered stereotypes about intelligence, capability, and social mobility, proving that human potential was distributed equally across all populations when given genuine opportunity. The Sullivan sisters demonstrated that society's most vulnerable children often possess the greatest capacity for transformative leadership. Samuel reported to Congress. Their own achievements, and those of the thousands of children who followed their example, have fundamentally changed American understanding of human potential. Dr. Margaret Whitfield, now in her 70s and serving as Surgeon General of the United States, had established medical protocols for treating trafficking victims that were being adopted worldwide. Her work had demonstrated that physical healing required addressing psychological trauma, leading to integrated treatment approaches that restored both body and spirit. The Sullivan sisters taught medicine that healing required more than treating symptoms. Dr. Whitfield explained to the International Congress of Physicians. Their recovery from severe trauma showed us that human resilience, when properly supported, could overcome experiences that seemed insurmountable. The international impact of their work continued expanding through correspondence networks, professional exchanges, and diplomatic initiatives. The Sullivan Method had become America's most successful cultural export, spreading principles of child protection, trauma recovery, and educational innovation throughout the developing world. Representatives from 23 nations attended the signing ceremony, many seeking to establish Sullivan Centers in their own countries. The techniques developed by 4 rescued children had become tools for protecting millions of vulnerable youth worldwide. As the ceremony concluded and dignitaries dispersed, the 4 sisters gathered on the steps of the Federal Bureau of Child Protection. Around them, the bustling capital city of 1912 demonstrated the transformation their work had helped create. Street children had virtually disappeared from American cities, replaced by educational programs that provided every child with genuine opportunity for advancement. "Do you remember," Charlotte asked her sisters as they looked out over the transformed landscape, "when we thought we were fighting just to survive until tomorrow?" Emily smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had learned to measure progress in statistical improvements that saved lives. "We were fighting for tomorrow. We just didn't understand how many tomorrows we were protecting." Grace carried a sketchbook, as she always did, but now her drawings depicted hope rather than trauma, possibility rather than desperation. Every child we helped gave us strength to help another. It became a multiplication rather than just addition. Rose, whose gentle nature remained unchanged despite her global recognition, spoke with the wisdom that had always set her apart. "We learned that healing doesn't end with survival. It continues with helping others find their own strength." Jacob joined them on the steps, his weathered face reflecting pride in achievements that exceeded his most optimistic dreams. 4 desperate children became 4 remarkable women who changed the world. But more importantly, they proved that every child deserves the chance to discover their own extraordinary potential. The gentle rancher who had rescued 4 sisters from a mine had indeed given them something that changed history. Not just their individual lives, but the entire trajectory of child protection, educational philosophy, and social justice advocacy throughout America and beyond. Their story had become proof that love, courage, and unwavering commitment could transform not just individual lives, but entire societies. The network of protection they had built would continue expanding, ensuring that no child would ever again face the desperation they had known. As evening shadows lengthened across Washington, D.C., 4 sisters who had once faced sale into slavery stood as recognized leaders whose work protected millions of children worldwide. Their legacy would outlast their lifetimes, creating ripple effects that would benefit generations yet to come. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Every day brought new opportunities to prove that every child, regardless of their circumstances, possessed unlimited potential when given genuine opportunity and unwavering support. They had indeed changed history. 1 rescued child, 1 protective law, one healed heart at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.